The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Robert Martinez adjusted his worn military cap and checked his watch for the third time. The 58-year-old veteran had been waiting since dawn, clutching a manila folder containing documents that he believed would change everything. His weathered hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from a mixture of hope and nervous energy that had kept him awake for weeks. Robert had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer, defusing bombs and building roads that would help his fellow soldiers navigate the dangerous terrain. When he returned home to Cedar Falls, a small town in Iowa, he expected to find the same community spirit that had sent him off to war with flags and prayers. Instead, he found a town struggling with economic decline, where the local factory had closed and many families were losing their homes to foreclosure. The courthouse behind him was hearing a case that had divided the town for months. Mayor Patricia Kellerman and the city council were pushing through a development project that would demolish the old Veterans Memorial Park to make way for a shopping complex. The developers promised jobs and tax revenue, but Robert and other veterans saw it as an erasure of their sacrifice and the memory of fallen comrades whose names were etched on the memorial stone. Robert had tried the proper channels first. He attended city council meetings, spoke during public comment periods, and organized peaceful protests with other veterans. Each time he was met with polite nods and empty promises that their concerns would be considered. The mayor often reminded everyone that progress required difficult decisions and that the town needed economic growth more than symbolic gestures. But Robert knew something the city council didn't. During his research into the memorial park's history, he had discovered irregularities in the original land deed. The property had been donated specifically for veteran services and memorials, with legal restrictions that prevented commercial development. His folder contained copies of the original documents, witness statements from elderly residents who remembered the donation ceremony, and expert opinions from lawyers who confirmed his findings. The courthouse doors opened, and people began filing in for the morning session. Robert recognized many faces: city council members, the mayor's staff, developers in expensive suits, and a handful of supporters who had stood by him throughout his fight. Judge Harrison Wells, known for his no-nonsense approach and quick decisions, would be presiding over the case. As Robert entered the courtroom, he noticed the stark contrast between the two sides. The city's legal team occupied several tables laden with thick binders and laptop computers. Their lead attorney, Marcus Davidson, was a partner at the state's most prestigious firm, brought in specifically to handle this case. On Robert's side sat a single table where Jenny Patterson, a young public interest lawyer who had volunteered her services, was organizing her modest collection of documents. The gallery was packed with townspeople, split almost evenly between supporters and opponents of the development. Robert could feel the weight of their expectations, knowing that this moment represented more than just a legal dispute. It was about whether the voice of those who had served their country would be heard and respected in their own hometown. Judge Wells called the court to order with a sharp bang of his gavel. The attorney for the city stood first, presenting what seemed like an overwhelming case for the development project. He spoke of economic studies showing increased revenue, job creation statistics, and engineering reports confirming the feasibility of the shopping complex. His presentation was polished and professional, filled with charts and projections that painted a picture of prosperity and progress. When it came time for Robert's testimony, he approached the witness stand with the quiet dignity that had carried him through combat zones and difficult homecomings. He spoke clearly about his service, his love for his community, and his discovery of the legal restrictions on the Memorial Park property. His voice remained steady as he described finding the original deed in the county archives, buried beneath decades of bureaucratic filing. But as Robert began to explain the legal implications of his findings, he noticed a change in Judge Wells' demeanor. The judge's attention seemed to wander, and he frequently checked his watch. When Robert attempted to present the original deed documents, Judge Wells interrupted him with a wave of his hand. The judge's dismissal was swift and cutting. He stated that the court needed to focus on current economic realities, rather than outdated documents and sentimental attachments to the past. He questioned Robert's legal expertise and suggested that a veteran's emotional connection to a memorial might cloud his judgment about what was best for the community's future. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. After everything he had endured in service to his country, after months of careful research and legal preparation, his testimony was being dismissed as mere sentiment. The judge's tone implied that Robert's military service, rather than giving weight to his words, somehow disqualified him from understanding complex legal and economic matters. As Judge Wells continued his dismissal, explaining that the court would prioritize expert testimony from qualified professionals over the well-meaning but misguided concerns of local residents, Robert felt a familiar sensation. It was the same feeling he had experienced in Afghanistan when bureaucratic decisions made by people, far from the battlefield, put soldiers' lives at risk. The courtroom fell silent as Robert stood to leave the witness stand. His supporters in the gallery looked stunned, while the city officials appeared relieved that this obstacle to their plans had been so easily removed. But Robert Martinez was not defeated. As he walked back to his seat, his mind was already turning to the phone calls he needed to make, and the network of relationships he had built over decades of service and community involvement. Outside the courthouse, news of the judge's dismissal spread quickly through the small town's interconnected community. Social media posts and text messages carried the story beyond Cedar Falls, reaching veterans organizations, trucking companies, and supporter networks across the state. The dismissal of Robert's testimony was about to become something much larger than a local dispute over a memorial park. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the balance between institutional authority and grassroots determination, between economic progress and historical preservation, between the voice of those in power and those who had served their country in distant lands. Word of Judge Wells's dismissive treatment of Robert Martinez spread through the veteran community like wildfire. By noon, the story had reached the Iowa Veterans Network, a loose confederation of former service members who stayed connected through social media, truck stops, and VFW halls across the state. The network had been built over years of shared experiences, mutual support during difficult transitions to civilian life, and a deep understanding that sometimes veterans had to look out for each other when institutions failed them. Tommy Richardson was pulling his 18-wheeler into a truck stop outside Des Moines when his phone buzzed with a message from his Army buddy Jake Morrison. The text was simple but urgent. Judge just dismissed Bobby Martinez in court. Said we don't know what we're talking about. You remember Bobby from the 82nd? Tommy remembered Robert well. They had served together for 6 months in Kandahar, where Robert's expertise with explosives had saved countless lives, including Tommy's own. As Tommy read the full account of the courthouse proceedings, his jaw tightened. The same man who had risked his life daily to clear roads for supply convoys was being told his voice didn't matter in his own hometown. Tommy knew that feeling. The strange disconnect of returning from a war zone where your skills and judgment were literally matters of life and death, only to find civilians treating you like you couldn't understand simple problems. Tommy immediately started making calls. His first was to Maria Santos, a former Marine logistics coordinator who now ran a small trucking company in Council Bluffs. Maria had built her business by hiring veterans who struggled to find work after their service, understanding that the discipline and reliability that made good soldiers also made excellent drivers. When she heard about Robert's situation, her response was immediate and decisive. "This is bigger than one courthouse case," Maria told Tommy during their phone conversation. "This is about whether our service means anything when we come home. How many times are we going to watch good people get steamrolled by politicians and developers who never risked anything for their community?" Within hours, Maria had reached out to her network of veteran drivers. Many of them had their own stories of being dismissed or overlooked, despite their service and expertise. There was Carlos Vega, who had been told by a city planning committee that his suggestions for improving emergency response routes weren't relevant because he wasn't a professional urban planner, despite his years as a combat medic navigating dangerous streets in Baghdad. There was Susan Wright, whose proposals for helping homeless veterans had been ignored by county officials who claimed she was too emotionally involved to provide objective solutions. The trucking community has its own communication system, built around CB radios, truck stop bulletin boards, and informal networks that span the interstate highway system. By evening, drivers across the Midwest were hearing about the situation in Cedar Falls. The story resonated not just with veterans, but with working-class Americans who felt their voices were increasingly ignored by people in positions of authority. David Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American who had served in the Navy before becoming an owner-operator trucker, was hauling freight through Nebraska when he heard the story on his CB radio. David had faced his own struggles with being taken seriously, first as an Asian American in the military, then as an immigrant son in the trucking industry. But he had learned that respect had to be earned through action, not just demanded through position. The conversation on the CB frequencies that night was unlike anything many drivers had experienced. Usually the radio chatter was about traffic conditions, weather reports, and casual conversation to break up the loneliness of long hauls. But this night, drivers were sharing stories about times they had been dismissed or underestimated, about the gap between the respect they received in theory and the reality of their daily interactions with authority figures. By midnight, an informal plan was taking shape. It started with a suggestion from Maria Santos during a conference call with a dozen veteran truckers. "What if we showed up?" she asked. "Not to cause trouble, but just to show that Robert Martinez isn't alone. That when you dismiss one veteran's voice, you're dismissing all of us." The idea gained momentum quickly. Truckers began checking their schedules and routes, calculating distances and delivery times. The beauty of the trucking industry is its flexibility. Independent operators can often adjust their schedules, and even company drivers sometimes have discretion about timing their loads. More importantly, many drivers were already carrying freight that would take them through Iowa in the coming days. Social media played a crucial role in spreading the word beyond the immediate trucking community. Veterans organizations shared the story. Military family support groups picked it up, and it began appearing on platforms where people who had never served in the military expressed outrage at the judge's treatment of Robert Martinez. The narrative was simple and powerful. A veteran who had served his country with honor was being silenced when he tried to serve his community. Back in Cedar Falls, Robert Martinez was unaware of the growing movement forming around his case. He spent the evening after the court session reviewing his legal options with Jenny Patterson, his volunteer attorney. They discussed the possibility of an appeal, but both knew that would take months and might not succeed. The city council was scheduled to vote on the development project within a week, and once that vote passed, the legal landscape would become much more complicated. Jenny had been researching similar cases across the country, looking for precedents that might help their cause. She was a recent law school graduate who had chosen public interest work over more lucrative opportunities, driven by a belief that the legal system should protect ordinary citizens, not just those who could afford the best representation. The dismissive treatment Robert had received in court reinforced her conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with how institutions treated people without power or connections. As Jenny worked late into the night, preparing for what might be their last legal opportunity, she received an unexpected phone call from Maria Santos. The trucker had gotten Jenny's number from Robert and wanted to discuss something that might help their case. Jenny listened with growing amazement as Maria described the convoy that was forming, the veterans and supporters who were planning to converge on Cedar Falls to show solidarity with Robert's fight. "I'm not a lawyer," Maria explained. "But I know something about logistics and I know something about making a statement. Sometimes you have to show people that their actions have consequences, that dismissing someone doesn't make them go away." The call ended with Jenny promising to keep Maria informed about the court schedule and any developments in the case. As she hung up the phone, Jenny realized that this local dispute over a memorial park was about to become something much larger. The next few days would test whether grassroots organizing and community pressure could influence a legal system that seemed increasingly disconnected from the people it was supposed to serve. Across the Midwest, truck engines were warming up and routes were being planned for an unprecedented demonstration of solidarity, with a veteran whose voice had been dismissed, but whose cause had found powerful allies. Dawn broke over the interstate highways of the Midwest as an unusual migration began. From truck stops in Missouri, Illinois, Nebraska, and Minnesota, dozens of 18-wheelers started moving toward Iowa. Each driver had made personal sacrifices to participate, rearranging delivery schedules, taking unpaid time off, or using precious rest days that were legally mandated after long hauls. Their motivation went beyond solidarity with Robert Martinez. It was about proving that working-class Americans still had a voice in their democracy. Tommy Richardson had barely slept at the truck stop outside Des Moines. He spent most of the night coordinating with other drivers on CB radio and his smartphone, helping organize what was becoming the largest spontaneous trucker convoy in recent memory. His logbook showed he had enough driving hours remaining to make the trip to Cedar Falls, but more importantly, he had convinced his dispatcher to give him a load that would take him through the area anyway. The convoy wasn't just truckers. Word had spread to other veteran networks, and cars, motorcycles, and pickup trucks were joining the procession. Sarah Mitchell, a former Air Force mechanic who now worked at a manufacturing plant in Kansas City, had called in sick and driven through the night to participate. She brought with her a carload of fellow veterans from her VFW post, all of whom had been following the story on social media. Marcus Davidson, the high-powered attorney representing the city, was in his hotel room preparing for what he expected to be a routine hearing when his assistant called with news about unusual traffic patterns around Cedar Falls. The Iowa State Patrol had reported an increasing number of large trucks and vehicles with veteran-related bumper stickers and license plates heading toward the small town. Davidson initially dismissed this as coincidence, focusing instead on the legal briefs he planned to present to Judge Wells. At the courthouse, Sheriff Patricia Williams was beginning to worry. Her small department had received calls from residents reporting heavy truck traffic on roads that rarely saw commercial vehicles. Williams was a 20-year law enforcement veteran who had handled everything from domestic disputes to tornado responses. But she had never dealt with anything quite like this. She placed a call to the State Patrol for backup and began reviewing crowd control procedures. Judge Wells arrived at the courthouse at his usual time, unaware of the developing situation. His secretary, Helen Morrison, had been fielding calls since early morning from reporters, legal observers, and curious citizens asking about the case involving the veteran in the memorial park. Wells instructed her to refer all calls to the court's public information officer and proceeded with his normal pre-hearing routine. Meanwhile, Robert Martinez was at home, reviewing his testimony one final time with Jenny Patterson. They had decided to focus on the specific legal violations they had discovered, hoping that a more technical presentation might overcome the judge's earlier dismissal. Robert's wife, Carmen, was preparing coffee for what she expected to be another difficult day. She had watched her husband's dedication to this cause consume him for months, and she worried about what another courtroom defeat might do to his spirit. The first trucks began arriving in Cedar Falls around 10 in the morning. Tommy Richardson led a group of 5 vehicles that parked legally along Main Street, several blocks from the courthouse. The drivers were careful to follow all traffic laws and parking regulations, understanding that any violations could be used to dismiss their demonstration. Tommy had served as a convoy leader in Afghanistan and knew the importance of discipline and coordination in any operation. Maria Santos arrived shortly afterward with another group of trucks, including several driven by female veterans who brought a different perspective to the demonstration. Among them was Linda Rodriguez, a former Army supply sergeant who had served 2 tours in Iraq before starting her own small trucking business. Linda had faced discrimination both as a woman in the military and as a Latina entrepreneur, and she understood the intersection of respect, authority, and identity that Robert's case represented. The sight of large commercial trucks lining the streets of small-town Cedar Falls was unprecedented. Local residents came out of their homes and businesses to see what was happening. Some were supportive, recognizing the veterans' service and sympathizing with Robert's cause. Others were concerned about disruption to their quiet community and worried about the economic implications if the development project was delayed or canceled. News crews from Des Moines and Cedar Rapids had gotten word of the developing story and were setting up equipment around the courthouse. What had started as a local zoning dispute was becoming a regional news event, with implications that extended far beyond the borders of Cedar Falls. The story was beginning to attract attention from national veteran advocacy organizations and civil rights groups. By noon, more than 30 trucks had arrived in Cedar Falls, along with dozens of cars and motorcycles carrying veterans and supporters from across the region. The convoy participants maintained strict discipline, keeping their vehicles properly parked and avoiding any behavior that could be construed as intimidating or disruptive. Many of the veterans wore their service medals and military unit insignia, creating a powerful visual reminder of their sacrifice and service. David Chen had driven his truck from Nebraska, adjusting his delivery schedule to participate in the demonstration. As he parked on a side street near the courthouse, he reflected on his father's stories about protests and civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s. His father had always emphasized that real change required ordinary people to stand up and be counted, even when it was difficult or costly. The local police were struggling to manage the situation. Sheriff Williams had requested additional support from the state patrol, but she was also trying to balance public safety concerns with respect for the First Amendment rights of the demonstrators. She approached Tommy Richardson, who had emerged as an informal spokesman for the convoy, to discuss ground rules and ensure that the demonstration remained peaceful. "We're not here to cause trouble," Tommy explained to the sheriff. "We're here because one of our own was dismissed in court yesterday, and we want to show that his voice matters. We'll follow all your rules and regulations, but we're not leaving until we've had our say." Sheriff Williams found herself in an unusual position. She was responsible for maintaining order, but she was also a veteran herself, having served in the Army Reserve before joining law enforcement. She understood the frustration that had brought these people to her town, even as she worried about the potential for the situation to escalate beyond her department's ability to control. Inside the courthouse, Judge Wells was beginning to understand that this was not going to be an ordinary day. His bailiff had reported the growing crowd outside, and he could hear the rumble of diesel engines even through the courthouse's thick walls. Wells was known for running a tight courtroom and maintaining strict control over proceedings, but he was beginning to realize that forces beyond his courtroom were now involved in this case. As the afternoon court session approached, the tension in Cedar Falls was building. The convoy participants maintained their disciplined stance, but their presence was impossible to ignore. Local businesses found themselves serving customers they had never seen before, working-class veterans from across the region who had traveled hundreds of miles to support one man's fight for respect and recognition. The stage was set for a confrontation between institutional authority and grassroots democracy, between the formal legal system and the informal networks of solidarity that connected veterans across the country. What happened next would determine not just the fate of a memorial park, but the broader question of whose voices mattered in American democracy. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Judge Harrison Wells called the court to order for what he expected to be the final hearing on the Cedar Falls Memorial Park case. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with standing room filled by veterans, local residents, and observers who had traveled from across the region. Outside, the rumble of diesel engines from more than 40 trucks created a constant background noise that penetrated even the courthouse's thick stone walls. Wells noticed immediately that the dynamics in his courtroom had shifted dramatically since the previous day. Marcus Davidson, the city's attorney, appeared less confident as he shuffled through his papers. Mayor Patricia Kellerman sat rigid in the gallery, clearly uncomfortable with the attention the case was now receiving. Most significantly, Robert Martinez sat at the defendant's table with a quiet dignity that seemed to draw strength from the support gathering outside. The judge opened the session by addressing the unusual circumstances surrounding the hearing. "The court is aware of the demonstration taking place outside this building," Wells announced. "While the court respects the First Amendment rights of all citizens, these proceedings will be conducted according to established legal procedures, without regard to outside pressure or influence." Jenny Patterson stood to present additional evidence that had been overlooked in the previous day's proceedings. She had spent the night refining her arguments, focusing on the irrefutable legal documentation that proved the Memorial Park property was legally protected from commercial development. Her presentation was methodical and precise, building a case that even Judge Wells would find difficult to dismiss on technical grounds. But as Jenny spoke, the sounds from outside grew louder. More vehicles were arriving, and the convoy participants were beginning to organize themselves in a more visible manner. Tommy Richardson had coordinated with other veteran leaders to arrange the trucks in formation along the streets surrounding the courthouse, creating an impressive display of solidarity that was impossible to ignore. Sheriff Patricia Williams found herself in an increasingly complex situation. The demonstration remained peaceful and legally compliant, but the sheer number of participants was straining her resources. She had called for additional state patrol support, but she was also receiving pressure from Mayor Kellerman to find ways to disperse the crowd. Williams knew that any heavy-handed response could escalate the situation and potentially create a public relations disaster for the city. Inside the courtroom, Judge Wells was struggling to maintain his usual air of authority. The presence of so many veterans, many wearing their service medals and unit insignia, was a powerful reminder that his dismissive treatment of Robert Martinez had insulted not just one man, but an entire community of people who had sacrificed for their country. Wells found himself glancing repeatedly toward the windows, where the sound of truck horns and diesel engines reminded him that his courtroom was no longer an isolated space. Maria Santos had positioned herself as a liaison between the convoy participants and local authorities. Her experience managing logistics for her trucking company served her well in coordinating the demonstration, ensuring that vehicles remained legally parked and that participants understood the importance of maintaining discipline. She carried a handheld radio that kept her in constant communication with convoy leaders positioned throughout the town. As Jenny Patterson continued her legal presentation, she introduced testimony from Dr. Elizabeth Harris, a legal historian from the University of Iowa, who had researched the original land grant that created the memorial park. Dr. Harris explained that the donor's intent was explicitly documented, with legal language that permanently restricted the property's use to veteran services and memorial purposes. Her testimony was detailed and scholarly, providing the kind of expert analysis that Judge Wells had claimed was missing from Robert's presentation. The judge found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The legal evidence presented by Dr. Harris was compelling and difficult to dismiss, but accepting it would require him to reverse his previous ruling and admit that he had been wrong to dismiss Robert Martinez's testimony. Wells was a proud man who had built his judicial reputation on decisive rulings and courtroom control, and the prospect of backing down was deeply unsettling. Outside the courthouse, the demonstration was evolving into something more organized and powerful. David Chen had worked with other participants to create informational displays about veteran issues, transforming the convoy from a simple show of force into an educational opportunity for the community. Veterans shared their stories with local residents, explaining their service experiences and their commitment to protecting memorials that honored fallen comrades. The media presence was also growing. Television crews from major markets across the Midwest had arrived to cover what was becoming a significant regional news story. The narrative was compelling, working-class veterans taking a stand against institutional dismissal and disrespect. Reporters interviewed convoy participants, local residents, and legal observers, creating a comprehensive picture of a community grappling with questions of respect, authority, and democracy. Linda Rodriguez, the former Army supply sergeant who now owned her trucking business, found herself speaking with a reporter from the Des Moines Register. She explained that the convoy represented more than just support for Robert Martinez. It was about whether veterans' voices would be heard and respected when they returned home from service. "We risked our lives for democracy overseas," she said. "We shouldn't have to fight for it when we come home." Back in the courtroom, the legal proceedings were reaching a crucial point. Jenny Patterson had presented overwhelming evidence that the memorial park was legally protected from commercial development, and she was now calling for the court to issue an injunction, preventing the city from moving forward with the shopping complex project. The legal case was strong, but the political and social pressures surrounding it were unprecedented. Judge Wells called for a brief recess to consider the evidence and testimony. As he retreated to his chambers, he could hear the crowd outside growing larger and more vocal. Veterans were sharing their stories. Local residents were engaging in conversations about community values and priorities, and the demonstration was taking on the character of a civic education event rather than a simple protest. Marcus Davidson, the city's attorney, used the recess to consult with Mayor Kellerman and other city officials. They were beginning to realize that their legal victory from the previous day had created a much larger problem. The convoy and demonstration had drawn regional attention to their development project, and the negative publicity could potentially damage the city's reputation and economic prospects far more than losing the case. When court reconvened, Judge Wells faced a packed courtroom where the tension was palpable. Veterans in the gallery sat with military bearing, their presence a constant reminder of service and sacrifice. Local supporters of the development project seemed increasingly uncomfortable, aware that they were now part of a much larger story about respect for veterans and community values. The judge's next words would determine not only the fate of the memorial park, but also whether the grassroots demonstration outside would be vindicated or dismissed. The convoy participants had traveled hundreds of miles and sacrificed their time and resources to support Robert Martinez's fight for recognition and respect. The question now was whether their presence would influence a judicial system that claimed to be above such pressure. As Judge Wells prepared to announce his decision, the sounds from outside served as a constant reminder that this case had implications far beyond the borders of Cedar Falls. The veteran community was watching, the media was reporting, and the principle of whether ordinary citizens' voices mattered in American democracy was being tested in this small Iowa courthouse. Judge Harrison Wells stood at the window of his chambers, looking down at the remarkable scene unfolding in the streets of Cedar Falls. More than 50 trucks now formed orderly lines along multiple blocks, their drivers and passengers engaged in conversations with local residents, media representatives, and each other. The demonstration had maintained its peaceful character while growing in size and significance throughout the afternoon. Wells had spent 30 years on the bench, handling everything from minor traffic violations to major criminal cases, but he had never faced a situation quite like this. The legal evidence presented by Jenny Patterson and Dr. Harris was compelling and thorough, making it clear that the Memorial Park property was indeed legally protected from commercial development. But the judge's dilemma went beyond legal technicalities to questions of authority, respect, and institutional credibility. His bailiff knocked on the chamber door to inform him that additional media crews had arrived from Chicago and Minneapolis, drawn by reports of the veteran convoy and the underlying legal dispute. The story was gaining traction on social media, with hashtags supporting Robert Martinez trending regionally and veteran advocacy, organizations sharing the story with their national networks. Wells returned to the courtroom at 4 o'clock to announce his decision. The packed gallery fell silent as he took his seat behind the bench, the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. Outside, Tommy Richardson had asked the convoy participants to turn off their engines and observe a moment of quiet during the court proceedings, creating an unusual hush over the normally busy streets of Cedar Falls. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony presented in this case, Judge Wells began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. This court finds that the plaintiff has presented compelling documentation regarding the legal restrictions on the Memorial Park property. The judge paused, aware that his next words would be scrutinized not only by the people in the courtroom, but by the regional media and the veteran community that had rallied around Robert Martinez's cause. He had built his judicial career on the principle that courts should operate independently of public pressure, but he was also aware that justice required more than technical legal analysis. The original land grant documents, authenticated by Dr. Harris and corroborated by historical records, clearly established that the Memorial Park property was donated with specific restrictions that prevent commercial development. Wells continued. These restrictions remain legally binding and have not been properly addressed by the proposed development project. Jenny Patterson felt her heart racing as she realized the direction of the judge's ruling. Beside her, Robert Martinez sat with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout the proceedings, but she could see his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The gallery remained absolutely silent, with veterans and local residents alike hanging on every word. Furthermore, Judge Wells said, his voice gaining strength, this court acknowledges that yesterday's proceedings did not adequately address the substantive, legal issues raised by Mr. Martinez. The court may have been too hasty in its initial assessment of the plaintiff's testimony and evidence. The admission sent a murmur through the courtroom. It was unusual for Judge Wells to acknowledge error, and his words represented a significant reversal from his dismissive treatment of Robert Martinez the previous day. Marcus Davidson, the city's attorney, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. realizing that his seemingly easy victory was evaporating. Therefore, the judge announced, this court grants a permanent injunction, preventing the city of Cedar Falls from proceeding with any commercial development of the Memorial Park property. The property must remain dedicated to its original purpose as specified in the legal documentation presented to this court. The courtroom erupted in restrained celebration as veterans and supporters absorbed the magnitude of the decision. Robert Martinez closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the vindication of his months-long fight. Jenny Patterson reached over to shake his hand, her face beaming with the satisfaction of a hard-fought legal victory. Outside, word of the decision spread quickly through the convoy participants. Tommy Richardson received a text message from a supporter inside the courtroom and immediately shared the news over his CB radio. The response was immediate and joyful. Truck horns began honking in celebration, and veterans embraced each other with the relief of a mission accomplished. But Judge Wells was not finished. As the courtroom settled down, he continued with remarks that went beyond the legal requirements of his ruling. This court also wishes to acknowledge the service and sacrifice of the veterans who have participated in these proceedings, both as parties to the case and as supporters in the community. The judge's tone had changed from the bureaucratic language of legal rulings to something more personal and reflective. Mr. Martinez, your service to this country and your dedication to preserving the memory of fallen comrades deserves recognition and respect. This court regrets that its initial response to your testimony may not have adequately conveyed that appreciation. The apology was unprecedented in Judge Wells's courtroom. Veterans in the gallery sat up straighter, recognizing the significance of a federal judge acknowledging not just legal error, but a failure to show proper respect for their service and sacrifice. The moment represented more than a legal victory. It was institutional recognition of their worth and their right to be heard. Mayor Patricia Kellerman sat in stunned silence as the implications of the ruling became clear. The development project that had promised economic revitalization for Cedar Falls was dead, at least in its current form. The political consequences for her administration would be significant, and she would need to explain to constituents how such a fundamental legal error had been missed during the planning process. Dr. Harris, the legal historian whose testimony had been crucial to the case, felt vindicated in her decision to participate. As an academic, she understood the importance of historical preservation and legal precedent, but she had also been moved by Robert Martinez's dedication to honoring his fellow veterans. The ruling demonstrated that careful scholarship could still influence real-world outcomes. Maria Santos received the news of the court victory over her radio and immediately began coordinating the convoy's response. The demonstration had achieved its primary goal of supporting Robert Martinez and ensuring that his voice was heard, but the participants also wanted to celebrate responsibly and begin the process of returning to their normal lives and work obligations. As the court session officially ended, Robert Martinez found himself surrounded by supporters, media representatives, and fellow veterans who wanted to congratulate him on his victory. The quiet dignity that had carried him through months of frustration and disappointment remained intact, but there was also a sense of relief and gratitude for the community that had rallied to his cause. Outside the courthouse, the convoy participants began preparing for their departure from Cedar Falls. Many had long drives ahead of them to return to work and family obligations, but they had achieved something significant. They had demonstrated that working-class veterans could organize effectively, maintain discipline under pressure, and influence institutional outcomes through solidarity and persistence. The victory belonged not just to Robert Martinez, but to everyone who had taken the risk of standing up for their principles. The judge's decision had validated their belief that veteran voices deserved respect and recognition, and that democracy still functioned when ordinary citizens were willing to participate in it, actively and peacefully. 3 months after the convoy rolled into Cedar Falls, the Veterans Memorial Park had been transformed into something far more meaningful than anyone had originally envisioned. Robert Martinez stood before the restored memorial stone, reading the names of fallen soldiers as he did every morning during his daily walks. The legal victory had saved the park from commercial development, but the broader impact of the demonstration had created opportunities that no one had anticipated. The story of the convoy had resonated far beyond Iowa's borders. Veterans organizations across the country had taken notice of how effectively the truckers and their supporters had organized, creating a model for grassroots advocacy that was being replicated in other communities facing similar challenges. The demonstration had shown that working-class veterans could mobilize quickly and effectively when their voices were being ignored or dismissed. Tommy Richardson had returned to his regular trucking routes, but his life had changed in unexpected ways. The convoy had connected him with veterans from across the region, creating a network of relationships that extended far beyond their shared military service. He had received calls from organizers in other states who wanted advice on planning similar demonstrations, and he found himself becoming an informal spokesman for veteran truckers who felt disconnected from traditional advocacy organizations. The success in Cedar Falls had also attracted attention from labor unions and working-class advocacy groups who recognized the power of the convoy model. Tommy had been invited to speak at conferences and meetings, sharing lessons learned about organizing, maintaining discipline during demonstrations, and building coalitions across different communities. His experience as a convoy leader in Afghanistan had translated into skills that were valuable in civilian advocacy work. Maria Santos had expanded her trucking business, hiring additional veteran drivers who had been inspired by the Cedar Falls demonstration to seek opportunities in the transportation industry. Her company had become a hub for veterans who wanted to maintain connections with their military communities while building civilian careers. The convoy had demonstrated that veteran-owned businesses could serve as more than just economic enterprises. They could be centers of community, organizing, and mutual support. The media attention from the convoy had also brought unexpected opportunities. Maria had been featured in trucking industry publications and veteran magazines, raising the profile of her business and creating new contracts with companies that wanted to support veteran-owned enterprises. More importantly, she had used her platform to advocate for better services for returning veterans, particularly in rural areas where resources were limited. Jenny Patterson, the young attorney who had represented Robert Martinez, found her career transformed by the case. The legal victory had established her reputation as an effective advocate for underprivileged clients, and she had received job offers from civil rights organizations and public interest law firms across the country. She chose to remain in Iowa, opening her own practice that specialized in representing veterans and working-class clients who were often overlooked by the legal system. The relationship between Jenny and the veteran community that had supported Robert's case continued to evolve. She provided legal services to convoy participants who faced employment discrimination or bureaucratic obstacles in accessing veteran benefits. The network that had formed around the Cedar Falls demonstration became a source of referrals and support for her practice, creating a sustainable model for providing legal services to underserved communities. Judge Harrison Wells had also been affected by the events in his courtroom. The convoy and the national attention it generated had forced him to confront his own assumptions about the relationship between institutional authority and community input. He began incorporating more opportunities for community voices in his courtroom procedures, particularly in cases that affected working-class and veteran populations. Wells had privately reached out to Robert Martinez several weeks after the ruling, inviting him to lunch to discuss the case and its aftermath. The conversation had been awkward initially, but it evolved into a genuine dialogue about the gap between legal institutions and the communities they served. The judge's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from the experience had surprised Robert and contributed to a growing mutual respect. The memorial park itself had become a symbol of successful grassroots organizing and community preservation. The city of Cedar Falls, faced with the reality that their development project was legally impossible, had worked with veteran organizations to enhance the park's facilities and programming. Federal grants and private donations had funded improvements that made the space more accessible and meaningful for veterans and their families. David Chen, the second-generation Chinese-American trucker who had driven from Nebraska to participate in the convoy, had used his experience to organize similar demonstrations in support of immigrant veterans who faced unique challenges in accessing services and recognition. His story had been featured in Asian American veteran publications, highlighting the diversity within the veteran community and the importance of building coalitions across ethnic and cultural lines. The convoy model had spread to other issues beyond veteran affairs. Environmental groups had adopted similar tactics to protest pipeline projects. Labor unions had organized convoy-style demonstrations in support of striking workers, and civil rights organizations had used truck convoys to draw attention to voting rights issues. The Cedar Falls demonstration had provided a template for peaceful, disciplined grassroots organizing that could influence institutional decision-making. Robert Martinez had become an inadvertent spokesman for veteran advocacy, speaking at conferences and meetings across the region about the importance of preserving military history and honoring service members' contributions to their communities. His quiet dignity and persistence had made him an effective representative for veterans who felt disconnected from traditional political processes. The success of the convoy had also influenced how other judges and legal professionals approached cases involving veteran issues. Legal education programs began incorporating lessons from the Cedar Falls case, emphasizing the importance of understanding community context and treating all parties with respect, regardless of their background or representation. Sheriff Patricia Williams, who had managed the security challenges during the convoy demonstration, had been promoted to a regional law enforcement position where she specialized in managing large-scale peaceful demonstrations. Her experience in Cedar Falls had taught her valuable lessons about balancing public safety concerns with First Amendment rights, and she had become a resource for other law enforcement agencies facing similar challenges. As Robert Martinez finished his morning walk through the Memorial Park, he reflected on how much had changed since that frustrating day in Judge Wells's courtroom. The convoy of truckers who had answered his call for support had created something larger than any of them had imagined. A network of veterans and supporters who continued to advocate for each other and their communities. The Memorial Park remained dedicated to honoring fallen soldiers, but it had also become a symbol of what could be accomplished when ordinary citizens refused to accept dismissal and disrespect. The convoy had proven that working-class Americans still had the power to influence institutions and protect the values they held dear, as long as they were willing to organize, maintain discipline, and support each other through difficult struggles. The legacy of those 4 minutes when Judge Wells dismissed Robert's testimony and the convoy that formed in response continued to inspire veterans and advocates across the country who faced their own battles for recognition and respect.